Hello, and welcome to another indie author interview here on Plot Mom. Today, I have someone very special. His name is John. He is a dear friend of mine. He writes fantastic books. And without further ado, I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Hi. Well, it turns out my name is John. I think you learned that already. Anyway, I'm John Morey, author of an urban fantasy series starring Lucy December, a Jewish vampire who's also a private detective in San Francisco, fighting everything from demons to Sumerian gods on up. The first book, Bloodhound, has been out for a little over a year. The second book, Silver Cross, is in the final editing stages. So there are also plenty of short stories, other things related to it. So I've been at this for a little while.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on here. I've been really looking forward to today. And for those in the audience, thank you so much for watching. We will be asking John all sorts of questions. So if you have any questions for him, feel free to put them in chat. I will be pulling them up on the screen as they come in, unless they are trollish questions, in which case they will languish in the chat. Be educated, my friends. But before that all kicks off, because I'm sure we're going to have a lot, let's get into the subject of today's talk, which is all about balancing realism and fantasy in fiction. So, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to writing books with a lot of mythological and religious elements?
Okay. Well, to start with, anyone who knows me will tell you I love monsters. Kind of always been the case. But when I was a little kid, little me, there was a toy line in the really early 90s called Monster in My Pocket. And what they did was they made figures out of obscure things from mythology. I have a couple here, like the bishop fish from European folklore, where they claim there was actually an undersea pope. I know. Or the seven-headed beast of Revelation. I kid you not, this really is. But this is the days before Google. So I had to go to the library and look things up. And I ended up discovering this wealth of stuff. I mean, whether it was, the Norse Ymir's, the giant whose body created the world, which is another Monster in My Pocket figure, or the entire thing of Japanese yokai, which goes everywhere, and just never really stopped researching. And I've always wanted to be creative, always wanted to write. And so they ended up dovetailing together. I mean, I mentioned it's an urban fantasy series. So the concept and even the tagline is gods and monsters are real. Every myth is true. The world's on the surface level, our world, like in all these series, but everything else is underneath that.
Yeah.
Which means that whatever I include, instead of just making up a monster, I try to have some background for it. So in Bloodhound, Lucy is fighting one of Solomon's demons from the Ars Goetia.
That's so neat. I love that kind of thing. I love when books, like, they're entertainment, but they give me questions, and when I go and research those questions, there's actually answers to them, and it gets deeper and more nuanced, so that I can go back and reread them, and I'm like, oh, now I know all about this cool monster that I never would have before. But, it's something that I don't deal with a lot, because I write a lot of otherworld fantasy. But how do you approach that research?
Okay.
Like, how do you get into it?
Well, I have an unfair advantage because I went to school for history, so they drilled in how to research, but you don't have to, have an advanced degree or learn how to go through ancient artifacts. Thanks to the internet, and this is the big dirty secret, Google and Wikipedia are your friends. You just have to know what they are in context. Wikipedia is not your end-all be-all. It's a good jumping off point. You type something in and go, okay, then look it up. That's like there's a trend lately about how angels in the Bible, these weird multi-eyed, multi-headed things. If you didn't grow up in the church reading that, out of Wikipedia, you'll get, cherubim have 4 heads and 4 legs, and they're related to, the Sumerian thing, shady. And then from there, just go with it. And when you're using Google, you can find a bunch of sources. Look for a source of someone who likes the topic, and you'll find they've written more than you'll want. And then find 2 or 3 and see where they agree. Because sometimes you just have some people who put their own spin on it. Other times, most mythologies don't have a singular canon, and that's actually a fascinating thing about them. I'll get back to the Medusa thing in a later question because it's a good illustration. I know I didn't even start on now because I realized it would take a couple minutes, but the same thing applies if you're looking up history, is look up what a couple people have said. You'll find they interpret it differently, but you can, usually in the middle road, you can find just the fact in and of themselves. Challenge things that you think everybody knows. And I mean anything you think anybody knows. If you're used to playing video games, a shotgun is a range of like 2 feet, look up what a real shotgun range is. They're guns. If you look back at the Salem or previous witch trials and you have one idea of it, look again. Those usually didn't happen until they had someone like Augustus von Dornheim or Matthew Hopkins as basically a gangster, more or less, forcing the situation. And when you find out this new angle that you never realized, hey, or another one, since we also mentioned religion, it's Book of Revelation, not Revelations. There's no S. You will never find a translation with the S, and most people get it wrong. Most people in movies get it wrong, but most church people don't because they've read it. So you want the appearance of truth. You want, big word time, verisimilitude. You want your characters to look and sound like they're part of whatever tradition they're part of, and you don't always have to go too much deeper, but little things like that, it's important to look up.
Yeah, it is. And that verisimilitude is, I think, the suspension of disbelief, right? Because
it's the appearance of truth.
Yeah.
So, yeah. You have that. You have the accurate stuff, so you can get away with the wacky stuff.
I know that for me, I grew up speaking Italian, so every time I watch a movie and someone is using speaking Italian and the accent is wrong and it's very clearly an American trying to speak Italian, I immediately start laughing, even if the movie is incredibly serious. So I understand the people who are experts are going to see through it. And it's important that it be enjoyable for them. At least they see that you've tried, right?
Or what about when they mix up the Italian city-states that actually technically aren't Italy with Italy?
Yes.
Do I have to name any?
Yes.
You're reacting already. You know exactly what I mean.
I have some emotions about this topic.
Yes, you know exactly what I mean. So
speaking of emotions, this is a question that, always, I studied anthropology, specifically nutritional anthropology, while I was in school. And the big thing all through that was identifying your own biases and prejudices. So how do you go about that, especially when researching for a book where you might be immersing yourself in a character that has completely different biases and prejudices than you do?
Yeah. Well, first thing is, if you're writing fiction, and unless you're writing a polemic against something, if you are, okay, that's what you're doing. Live it up. You're going to get some flack for it. But if you're not doing that, you need to be careful that you don't accidentally write about it. So an example I was giving in conversation earlier is if you're writing a book about a vampire hunter who's a Catholic priest, but you hate the Catholic Church, maybe you shouldn't write that. Or maybe you should take a breath and say, okay, how can I not let my feelings show through? And you're not going to be thinking, my bias. You're going to be thinking, but this is the truth. Maybe, but for the sake of your world and your story, you got to be careful. And this applies even when you don't hate something. Like, ethnically, sure, I'm pretty Jewish, but I wasn't raised Jewish. So to write a Jewish character who's authentic, and I've actually had readers, like a Reformed Jew recently said, this is the most authentic Jewish character she's read. You need to look at this, stop, ask, what do the people who actually believe this say? What do the people who actually think this? How are they as human beings? And see things they say, see things, ask them, if you know someone, ask them, see things they talk amongst themselves, and keep it authentic. And you'll realize that people in general can be either good or bad. But, if you're writing off a whole group that you hate them because of a certain belief, maybe you shouldn't do that because they're human beings too, and a lot of them are still pretty good. And this extends to other things, like I mentioned shotguns. You might not like guns. That's understandable. But you might be writing a story where your cop character gets in a gunfight with a bunch of armed bad guys. It's important to have at least a basic idea of how firearms work. If you know a gun nut, ask him. He'll tell you everything. If you run into a gun nut, just go, hey, I was wondering about this. People love to talk about things they like. If you don't want to do that, go on YouTube. Or even, again, Wikipedia. They give you stats. But on YouTube, you can find someone with the exact make and model of firearm you want a character to have, and they'll be firing it. They'll be talking about it. You'll see exactly how many bullets fit in that thing. You'll see its range. And you don't have to be super nerdy, down to the last detail. But if you know enough that it feels accurate, you won't do something like the shotgun only has a range of 10 feet, or the reverse, the shotgun's a sniper rifle.
Yeah, I know nothing about guns, so both of those facts sounded equally plausible to me.
Or sword fighting. there's a wealth of information of people who found European sword fighting manuals, and they know how it worked. You don't have to go full crazy HEMA historical European martial arts nerd on it, because they can get kind of scary. But if you find out a few actual disarms or a few things, and you just slip those into your choreography, your whole thing will look better. Just little things like they're not going to clash with the swords holding it like this. If they try that, one guy's going to just grab the other one by the blade and take it.
Naturally.
The moment you include a move like that, your readers will go, whoa, this person knows their stuff. And you won.
you do, and it really doesn't have to go too deep.
Yeah.
But we're all nerds here, right?
We are.
I mean, everyone here is a nerd about something. And once you're a nerd about one thing, you tend to be nerds about everything else that crosses your desk that is mildly interesting. So we had talked this last Friday, I think, actually, about world building forever and never writing. And I have several friends who are researching forever and never writing. How do you not do that?
Look in terms of the story, what's actually going to happen in the story. And then after a while, you have to have the self-control to say, okay, I have what I need. I can look up the rest of the stuff on my own time. We're going forward. And especially with mythology, history, those are deep wells. I mentioned a little bit ago that there's no set canon for most of these. So I'll talk about Medusa for a few minutes. You probably heard of Medusa as a human priestess who was violated by Poseidon, then cursed by Athena. Ovid wrote that. This one specific guy. And Ovid had an issue with the Greek political leaders. And so he tried to write everything to show everything in authority is bad. The goddess Athena had nothing about her being petty, so he made up stories like, and then she cursed Arachne, and Medusa, blah, blah, blah. He wrote those to make the gods look bad. Before Ovid, Medusa was one of the Gorgon sisters. There were 3 of them. They were actually from like a lineage of monsters and deities, and they were like these almost pseudo underworld guardians. They also had wings. It was kind of cool. But the more you keep looking, the more you find different origin stories, the more you find the imagery going all the way back until there's Paleolithic art with the Gorgon face on it to ward off evil. And that's really fascinating. And if you're going to put Medusa in a story of yours, it means you can write about victim blaming, or you can write about something different, and they're both valid. You can just pick one version to go with it. But if you try to write a story and you're writing 5 versions of Medusa at once, it's going to be a little clunky. But knowing you have that freedom, it's just really great.
Yes, that is something that I've encountered a lot, where we imagine static points in time. Instead of this, vast expanse of time where, it can just jump from, ancient Greek and then Roman, and then we're in the Middle Ages. There is so much space between different times and how ideologies change during them. And it's very easy to go down rabbit holes. My family has a bit of a history buff problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem. We have a lot of people who are rather obsessed, and wonderfully so.
Oh.
But so that's a kind of leads into another question I have, which is you want to be accurate. There's a lot of impetus to have that sense of realism, have that like grounded feeling like there is a legacy and a history behind what you're including. But how do you integrate that mass of information into a story without it being an info dump, without it just being a history textbook?
Don't info dump more than you have to. The time will come to info dump. I'm sorry, guys. But figure out what details are relevant to the story, and you as a writer will have a voice you can use to phrase it, so you're not just listing facts. I cheat because I write in first person. So when Lucy's talking about, Cacrinolos is one of Solomon's demons, you get her personality in the description. But even then, I cut it off after a bit. I don't describe all 72. Ask yourself what works for the story and what's good for the story and what's enjoyable for the story. And stick with that. And also remember, you can always come back to something and sneak a little more info later in the narrative and a little more info later. It doesn't all have to be at once. And when you're writing about people who exist now, and by that I don't mean like a celebrity who's around now, but like I'm going to make one character who's Muslim, one character who's Christian, find out what you're writing about. It's not just, here's what the Jews say. There are a lot of different kinds of Jews. There are a lot of different kinds of Christians. There are a lot of different kinds of Muslims. Get a basic knowledge. You don't have to go too deep. It's nice if you do, but a basic knowledge of what different denominations or fields of thought or philosophies are. Find out if we're talking Mahayana Buddhism or Zen Buddhism. Are you talking, oh, Christian. Oh, cool. Are they Baptist, Presbyterian? Are they Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox? None of the above. Part of a small cult, Church of Christ, Church of God in Christ. It can keep going for a while, and they're distinct differences. Although most of the time you're going to be writing a normal human being who happens to believe something, and please don't forget that.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Knowing those differences, it's important.
It is, and again, I think there's a huge challenge in writing living cultures. There's an ethical challenge about who should write those, which is not necessarily a question I want to get into today because it's huge. There's a question of doing it respectfully and how to go through the entire process, and also there's just the question of where do you find accurate research? How do you create a character who both is representative of something and is the representative voice in a story, but isn't a stereotype?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are concerned that if I write this thing that I don't necessarily agree with, and I write it respectfully, will I be preaching to people? No. But it makes you into a better person. It makes your characters look better. Remember, human beings are human beings first and foremost. People are people. That's why on an individual level, you tend to get along with a lot more people than you do in groups. And so you want that character to have an authentic voice. You want their word choice to kind of match. So like if you know someone who says, oh, I'm feeling blessed today, you can probably guess who they are. But you'll never see, like, again, good old Hollywood. I pick on Hollywood and Christians because it's like half of the United States. So you think they just go next door and go, hey, dude, does this sound right? But no one does. That's why they even misspell Revelation. Your average Southern Baptist who goes to a random generic church will not sound like, hello, brother, what shall we do today? They don't have that weird tone. But then likewise, what's your average Muslim in fiction is either going to be a crazy tongue-wagging terrorist with bombs attached, or the strange mystic fellow with another mystic strange voice. The prophet says, and that's not normal. No. 99% of fictional Jews are really Yiddish. Not so many real Jews.
Nope, not in our generation at least.
I intentionally
get a grandma, maybe.
Well, that's from a specific cultural heritage from Eastern Europe. So I specifically made a Jewish character who is not Yiddish.
That's fantastic. I've been growing up with Yiddish, grandparents. It's very much like in my blood. I've been kvetching my whole life. But no, there is a huge amount of variety in every cultural group. In some ways, I almost find it easier when I've, thought about writing my own real world things, which are few and far between, because I am allergic to that kind of research usually. I find it quite a bit easier to actually deal with ancient cultures because A, you're unlikely to offend anyone if you're talking about like ancient Mesopotamia, and B, the amount of information out there. Not to say that it's limited. It can be someone's entire career, but the salient points that you can actually put in a novel tend to be a little bit less complicated than
you can make up stuff. You can make up stuff, but you can find fun things.
Yes.
There's a famous clay tablet. I believe it's in the British Museum. From it's Sumerian, I think. It's clay tablets are fragile, so it's amazing when they survive intact. And this one is to this merchant named Ia Nasir from one of his customers complaining about how he sold on substandard copper. It's like a whole block full of, do you find me a fool when you sold me this terrible shoddy product? And if you ask around, you'll find out that may be the only one you'll see, but there's like a storehouse worth of clay tablets complaining about Ia Nasir because he kept all the customer complaints in his own house, and that's why they're preserved. And that's great.
That's who we need to be writing novels about.
So again,
I'm dropping all my projects. I'm just writing about this crooked copper merchant and his list
and
of
textiles, land, investments. These are people. They're human beings. So you'll find wacky stuff the way you do with people now. You'll find troubling stuff. Studying history will make you uncomfortable. But people being people.
I always love thinking about, take our nerdiest nerd.
Yeah.
You're one of them. And put you down in, ancient Greece. But not in, the cool Athens ancient Greece where everyone was, doing philosophy, but just in, some little middle of nowhere town.
Yeah,
what would you have been nerdy about?
I don't know. I'd probably be dead.
I mean, that's fair. By this age, we're basically octogenarians. We're digging our own
that's another
graves.
thing everyone knows. Yes, the life expectancy was 40.
No.
The average life expectancy, counting infant child deaths, was 40.
Mm-hmm.
If you cut out the people who died before 12, see what I told you about history making you uncomfortable? If you forget those, your life expectancy was pretty close to what it is now. But
yeah,
they skewed the average, and that's normal.
It did, and I feel like the time period that the Western world thinks about the most are usually the time periods where the most horrible things were happening. Yes, life expectancy during the Black Death wasn't great.
I was in an argument about this when I was saying the same thing I said, and they were like, well, during the Black Plague, it cut down. And I said, look, the life expectancy for people working in the World Trade Center in September 2001 was very short, but no one was considered an old man at 40.
Yeah.
This was a catastrophe, not, well, guess we're all going to die by 50. No.
No, it was the what we consider the Black Death, the time when it just went rampant. I mean, it was multiple times. It wasn't just once.
Oh, yeah, it was an ongoing.
But that super famous one around 1514, I think, or something. Florence, that's the one that gets popularized everywhere. That lasted a few summers.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of things are shorter than we think. I mean, the Wild West was 15 years. The Confederacy was 4 years. Doritos Locos Tacos had been on the menu longer than the Confederacy was in existence. There's certain eras we think of. They can be shorter or sometimes longer. But,
yes,
when it says, yes, they're Edwardian, so during the reign of King Edward. Victorian can be longer because Queen Victoria lived for a long, long time. But, it's a set time period. We love setting things in the Roaring 20s. And trying to aim it sort of so it's not at the worst part of Prohibition, but before the Depression. So it's 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every Roaring 20s happens in those 3 years. They're basically just banging into each other.
Well, just think of the pandemic fiction.
Yeah.
We're going to get a lot of pandemic fiction that'll treat 2020 like it lasted for 10 years.
I mean, it did last for 10 years, let's be real.
You know what I mean, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, the impossible to miss question. What's the weirdest thing you've ever researched?
Oh, boy. The weirdest thing. You mean weirdest subject I chose to research or weirdest thing I found while researching? Because
either or both.
There's a lot of stuff. Now, the easy out would be if I bring up the fact that, yes, Terry Pratchett was telling the truth. There was a belief in vampire watermelons and pumpkins in certain regions up in the Balkans and the Carpathians.
Okay, you're going to have to give me a little bit more information about this.
So, again, certain areas in that region, it's spotty. It's not everybody. They didn't teach it in the Orthodox Church. There was the folk superstition that if you leave an object out overnight, it might then taste for blood. The source of this is if you leave your metal tools, they start to rust, and then, ow, it cuts you.
And
watermelons left on the vine start developing these red veins. And so some people, again, this is not super commonly believed. No more than the bishop fish was believed by everybody in Europe, though at least one pope affirmed it. Anyway, it's not, necessarily common believed, but it was believed that when you see the watermelon doing that, oh no, it has a taste for blood. It's coming after us. Quick, squash it.
Okay, is that going to be the next big Hollywood movie? Because we had a killer tire recently. Is it going to be a killer vampire watermelon?
It will never be as good as Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Or Return of the Killer Tomatoes, which was what's his name? The guy from ER? George Clooney's first movie. There's a scene in the movie when they stop and say, "Oh no, we ran out of budget. The movie can't go on." And then they just start pulling cereal boxes and frame to product place until they can raise the money. I love
movies like that.
I have a very Sophisticated taste in cinema, my friends.
So sophisticated. Basically, yes. Just wears a tuxedo all the time. Just your taste.
Oh boy, there are other things like I was looking into ancient Sumerian gods because there will be a future Lucy book where she's stuck in a gang war between Pazuzu and Lamashtu, and I realized that almost all the deities. Now I'm mashing in a bunch of cultures: Babylon, Sumeria, Mesopotamia, etc. Yes, but they did also share stuff too. Most of their gods were kind of scary and vicious. Like not even he's petty, but like. O Pazuzu, thou terror of mankind, do not come here, but protect me from Lamashtu, the goddess of child death. Or like, woe betide any man who comes across the goddess of love. You keep reading this and going, ooh, what a scary way to live. And then I found Ninkasi, goddess of beer. Praise be Ninkasi, bringer of the water of life. Her hymn contained a recipe. Now, logically, this meant water that won't get contaminated. Because, beer was a staple that built our cities along with bread. Because you could drink it and not get sick, even though it's sitting in a well. That's why the ancient Egyptians paid their workers in beer.
Yeah, and high in calories.
Exactly.
Very useful.
Oh, yeah.
Also, presumably, everyone was a little happier.
Yes. But yeah, when you're researching things, think about the assumption you bring in and say, this assumption's probably only right to a small extent. And then you'll find all sorts of awesome things. Like I mentioned, the witch trials. The guy in England, Matthew Hopkins, was the Witchfinder General, was not actually legal. He'd show up in a town during the English Civil War, so everyone's crazy, and say, yep, I'm here on the authority of the crown. And then he'd strong arm to find burn witches, charge a whole ton of money. And, any local magistrates had the choice of you go with this thing or you might be one too. Then he'd get out of there before anyone found out. And eventually Parliament heard about this and went, what? We don't have, what? No. So they started sending word out. And after one time, Hopkins showed up in a town and they greeted him with, hey, we heard it from Parliament. They say there's no Witchfinder General. He retired, moved all the way across the country and died. So, or von Dornheim was a terrifying figure. He was, a murderous dictator who used witches as his reason to kill anybody. But when he was gone, they stopped. So it's just knowing the context that people are people. Just because they're older doesn't mean that they're complete morons. It makes things a little more realistic and also gives you a pretty well pictured bad guy there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we are almost at the end of our half hour. They always go so quickly.
They really do. They do. But quick bits on research.
Absolutely.
If you can find the choice between a primary source, what someone actually said, versus a secondary source, someone talking about it, or a tertiary source, someone talking about the guy talking about the guy. Primary is best, and then secondary is super useful to help you interpret. They're all useful. Just keep in mind that if you want to know what kind of a person Al Capone was like, the things that people knew him said will make a big difference, as long as you realize that he could be a really cool, funny guy while also ordering deaths. It helps. Again, it's the appearance of truth you want. You don't want your sword fight to necessarily be super nerdy. You could, but include a little bit that's accurate. The police don't have to completely follow realistic procedures 100%. That makes for a difficult story to do. But having a little bit of it in there, some actual due process, will make your story better and feel less like your real world story is a fantasy world. And
just it grounds it. These are the details that we don't notice unless they're missing or done wrong.
Exactly. Look at how lawyers actually behave in court compared to most movies. Notice how My Cousin Vinny's famous for being accurate and it's really entertaining.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, John, for coming on today. I am so excited to have had you here. I'm really excited to have you back some Friday where we can get deeper into these topics because they fascinate me. As I said, my family are full of history buffs. My grandfather translated the Ugarit tablets.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
History buffs. But until then, there are a lot of people out there who love books full of juicy details, and yours is one of them. Oh, so tell them how to find you.
Well, when I said urban fantasy, I mean it's in a very similar genre to things like the Dresden Files, Supernatural, the Iron Druid Chronicles, Magic Bites, all of those. And the place to find me is I have a website, johnmoreyauthor.com. JOHNMOREY author.com. You can also find me on social media. On Facebook, you'll notice a John Morey author. That's actually the author account, not just my personal account. So you can follow that if you want. You can find me on Twitter. I just kind of post jokes there, but you can find me. And if you go to my site, there is an email list. If you sign up for the email list, you'll get a free novella. Not Bloodhound, this is an actual novel, but a free, it's a short story, but it's like 70 pages. It's not a short story. Bad Blood, and that's actually, I'm in the process of writing a new novella for the mailing list, after which point Bad Blood will then just move to the website, because the website also has short stories on it. So you can find stories, art, you can find where to order this book off Amazon, and you'll start finding previews for the next book, Silver Cross, very soon, because, hey, I'm hard at work writing.
I'm so very excited. And if you want an extra dose of John, he is part of the Plot Mom Discord server and absolutely wonderful to hang out with. So you should join that. As ever, it is the happening place. We have writing sprints, we have hangouts, we have a lot of fun over there. So if you're not part of it already, I will be posting the link for it in the description. It's not up yet, but I'll get it up shortly. But it's also on pretty much all of my other videos, so go find it. Come join us. And if anyone is writing and researching, go ahead and comment below with your questions or your best research tips and tricks. I'd love to hear about them. So until next time, until Friday, everyone, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, John. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we will see you soon.